Okay, our next speaker is going to be Bill Truels. His topic is the depository misdirection. Dr. William Truels is a practicing general surgeon in Oklahoma City with experience in trauma and wound surgery. And he published Breach of Faith in 1992, which describes the various forces opposed to President Kennedy at the time of his assassination. He's also published The Quatrains of Camelot, an extended poem describing the JFK assassination and its philosophical ramifications. He will discuss a three-dimensional analysis of Dealey Plaza, combined with the Zapruder film and the acoustics analysis of Dealey Plaza, and to show that the most likely origin of the four rear shots is from the third or fourth floor of the Daltex building, with one frontal shot from the grassy knoll. The author, sorry, I'm not seeing too well. The author presents the shots as viewed from each location, with the depository oak tree and Secret Service men in their proper positions. And I think you have some visuals, right? Okay, good. All right, thanks. Bill Truels.
Thank you. That's kind of a hard act to follow there with Ed, but everybody's been to Dealey Plaza countless times, and you see people pointing up this way and pointing up that way and looking this way and looking that way and trying to figure out how this assassination could have occurred, including me. And my wife has put up with it for about 20 years, and we're still married. But I'm a practicing general surgeon. I have taken care of gunshot wounds and have some knowledge of that, civilian gunshot wounds. So I come from some medical perspective, but there's going to be a lot of questions no matter which solution you come up with. What I did is I took the game JFK Reloaded, and I don't think it's on the market anymore, but I compared the three-dimensional aspect of it with my own pictures in Dealey Plaza and walking around Dealey Plaza and looking at the position of JFK in particular frames and what's in the background. And there's a surprisingly good correlation with that. And the nice thing about that is that you can click on any spot once you stop the car and look at it from those directions and see, well, is this shot possible? Is that shot possible? So that's that's what I did. Josiah Thompson has said that no one will ever solve this problem. There's just too many variable factors, too many witnesses saying different things, too many people believing the shot was from the front, the shot was from the back. So what I'm doing is starting with certain premises. The one premise is that I think the acoustic tape as described by D.B. Thomas and the timing as described by D.B. Thomas, I'm accepting. That rules out someone earlier saying there were 11 shots. On the acoustics, there's 4 rear shots and 1 frontal shot. There's also a sixth shot that nobody can explain. There's no rifle spike, supersonic spike with it, and it's either pistol or firecracker. Nobody's really explained that. One person said it was a motorcycle that backfired, but that turned out probably not to be true. So let me go through these slides, and I'll present. I'm not the first one to say that some of these shots didn't come from the depository, and I'll go through each of the shots and tell you who claimed that they came from somewhere else. And we need someone to, if you can push the next slide. Kennedy's motorcade follows this route, as we all know. Next slide. Here's another analysis of it. Next slide. You notice that John Kennedy doesn't really come very much high off the back of the car. It's like maybe a shoulder blade and above, and his head that are above the back of the trunk. That he's sitting pretty deep, as is Jackie, in the car, and that's for protection that it's designed that way. You'll also notice that John Connolly is sitting inboard. Next slide. I've written a poem, epic poem about John Kennedy, so I sprinkled a few verses in here. What thoughts did John Kennedy entertain as he looked out on the Fort Worth rain? Do leaders ever think that they are looked upon as mortal prey? What machinations will fate impart? Will I soon this world depart? Will ill winds blow my way today as we travel in the motorcade? Next. This is the overhead position. None of these positions are exactly right, but you get the general idea. Connolly is inboard from Kennedy, and you notice he's holding a Stetson hat. And the funny thing about it is that the bullet that hits Johnson's right wrist enters the back of the wrist and comes out the front. And part of the problem with that single bullet theory is that it's got the bullet coming in here and going out here, coming through Connolly, going through the inside of the wrist and coming out the back. As Cyril Wecht has pointed out, the bullet comes in the back of the wrist as it's described here and out this other side. And it also, Connolly holds onto a Stetson hat at the time of this so-called magic bullet. He doesn't drop his hat until frame 326. And Cyril Wecht has made the point that there's no way you could hold on to your Stetson hat with a through-and-through shot to your wrist. Next slide. D.B. Thomas talked earlier. Next slide. I have accepted his time frame. The first shot, 175. The Connolly shot at 224. And I put the rogue shot, the shot to James Tague, I'm calling at 204, and I'll show you this in 3 dimensions. Then there's a 5-second pause, and then the last 2 shots, the frontal shot from the grassy knoll, which the acoustics identifies and pinpoints as from the grassy knoll. And that type of technology is used by submarines to locate enemy submarines. They use the acoustics when they ping. So this is a fairly accurate description that's described by the House Select Committee in 1978. And then a final shot at 326, which I will describe as the time when Connolly drops his Stetson hat. Next slide. The Warren Commission says there were 3 shots. They described the first shot to Tague, the second shot to Kennedy's back, and the third shot to Kennedy's head. One of the problems with that analysis that the Tague shot is way off. It's 100 feet off, and you think, well, if they're shooting at the president, why is this shot so far out of whack? And they never do explain it. So their explanation has a little bit of a problem. And my explanation says that none of the shots were more than 8 to 12 inches off of Kennedy's head. Next slide. The single bullet dilemma. You have one bullet that is supposed to go through Kennedy from the back, go slightly upward on his neck, then downward to Connolly's axilla or armpit, out his nipple, and then come and go through the back of his wrist and then the front. So that's not the position that he's holding his Stetson hat. He's holding his hat so that the inside of the wrist would be hit first. So that's another problem with this single bullet. Next slide. We'll go over that again too. The 78 House Select Committee came along and said, well, wait a second, this acoustic has another shot on it. And so what they did is they say, well, we'll call that the miss shot, and we'll say that there was a miss shot, number 3, from the grassy knoll. And then they kept the other shots along, but you still had this wild shot to James Tague. Next slide. What I'm proposing is, this is the sequence as described by D.B. Thomas. The first shot, 175. The miss shot, I'm calling to Tague at 204. The Connolly shot, which a lot of people feel occurs around 224 or thereabouts, as Josiah Thompson goes into some of this as well. The head shot, and then the final shot on the acoustics is at 326, and I'm saying that's when we see Connolly drop his Stetson hat. Next slide. I know you can have a lot of questions, but I will try to hold them till the end, and I'll try to explain some of the controversy. So these are the 3 shot comparisons: the Warren Commission, the 78 House Select Committee, and then the solution we're going to go through right now. You see all the shots really are clustered quite closely together. Next slide. Josiah Thompson and others pointed out that the oak tree blocks shots from 166 to 210 as viewed from the 6th floor window, and that was also established by the Warren Commission. Walt Brown, a researcher, makes the observation from looking at photographs for the witnesses in front of the depository that it's not clear that any shots came from the depository. He observed witnesses. What do the witnesses do in front of the depository? They run to the grassy knoll. Cyril Weck points out it's impossible to hold on to a Stetson hat when the radius bone, the largest bone in the wrist, is shattered by a rifle shot, as the single bullet theory argues. Next slide. Bob Groden, I talked to in Dealey Plaza a number of years ago. He thought that the Tague shot most likely came from the Dell Tech's building or the County Records building. And we'll look at this in 3 dimensions in just a minute. Josiah Thompson says that in his book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, he thinks the Connolly shot most likely came from either the County Records building or the Dell Tech's building, but not the depository because of the angle that Connolly is at as he turns and the trajectory through Connolly's armpit and out his nipple. And he published that more than 20 years ago. Cyril Weck talks about the magic bullet traveling upward and then downward. And Craig Roberts is a sniper and author in Tulsa, policeman and sniper in Vietnam also. And he looks out the depository window and says, "No way." And we'll look at that in just a minute too, the view from the depository. Next. This is the summary, and we'll go through these one at a time. These are D.B. Thomas's numbers, and I've assigned a direction for each of these shot. The first shot was 175. Next slide. This is the Mormon photo. Not sure how it got here, but this was taken just a fraction of a second before the headshot, I believe. And this is Officer Hargis writing right here. We'll come back to that in a minute. Next slide. This is a rough three-dimensional view from the depository at the headshot position 312 when you recreate it on the program. Actually, Kennedy's head has moved over. On the Mormon photo, you saw him moving over towards Jackie, and then Jackie's head is almost in front of John's. So the shot would have to come almost right over these 2 Secret Servicemen who are on the running board behind. And Joachim Marcus from Germany developed a computer program that's used in Germany for using 3-dimensional analysis of car accidents. And it's used all over Europe now. And you take pictures of the cars in different positions, you plug them in with dimensions, and then his program develops a 3-dimensional view. He did the same thing in Dealey Plaza about 5 years ago. And he said the same thing, that when you look through the depository window, that you have literally what he described as a sea of heads all around, making this shot very difficult for a headshot from the rear. Next slide. This is the view of the headshot position from the Dell Techs. These Secret Servicemen who originally were sitting on the back of the car during the first volley sit down during the second volley as they react to the shots. Clint Hill jumps off this car and starts running up to the limousine, but you can see that there's a clear shot here from the Dell Techs. Next slide. Misdirection. The guns were planted in the wrong building. If that's the case, why would they put guns in the 6th floor? Misdirection is the act of distracting and drawing someone's attention away from something. It's also used in military maneuvers and espionage. Next slide. The official version is that shots were fired from the rear. Oswald was in the depository, therefore Oswald must have fired the rear shots from the depository. That's the popular view in the media. Next slide. Problems with the Warren Commission. JFK and Connolly are hit with a single bullet. If that's the case, why do JFK's hands come up to his neck before he's shot in the neck? And we saw this earlier today in one of the presentations where Kennedy's hands are up to his neck and Connolly is turning around and has not yet been shot. So they've not been hit with the same bullet. And then the path of the bullet is not acceptable. The mass of the bullet supposedly retains 99% of its mass, yet it is there are fragments found in Connolly's right wrist that are much greater than the 1% lost in this bullet. And then why is the James Tabe shot so far off? Next slide. If the headshot is from the rear, why is Officer Hargis hit with such force? He's the motorcycle policeman riding left and behind Kennedy. Why are there fragments of bone embedded in his vest? And the obvious answer is that Kennedy was shot from the front and right. People at the grassy knoll see and smell gun smoke. And how does Connolly hold on to that Stetson hat so long after the wrist has supposedly been shattered? Next slide. So 3 premises. The Zapruder film is reasonably accurate. We know it has been. There are changes that were made in it. At the headshot sequence, there were frames that were removed, and Hoover said that there was an accidental break and that the film had to be respliced, and they accidentally reversed 2 frames and so on and so forth. So there have been some changes, but we're just generally accepting what's seen on the Zapruder. The acoustic tape, we're accepting the sequence as described by D.B. Thomas, and then the fact that there's the depository is blocked at 166 to 210. Next slide. And so let's talk a little more about the first shot. Next slide. This is taken from a motion picture that of what the tree looked like that day as viewed from Elm Street. I don't know exactly where the car was, but you can see that the window shooting here. If you're shooting in here, there's going to be a blockage, and they've worked it out as frames 166 to 210. Next slide. And here's the view of the depository window on that day. Next slide. Again, Kennedy's shoulder blade sticks up and his upper back, but the rest of it is below. And Connolly is inboard. So we have a dilemma. How does a bullet... We've got to do it with 1 bullet because we've only got 5 that we're getting on the acoustics. That we've had 3 rear shots in the first volley. We know 1 shot hits James Tague, and we know 1 shot hits Connolly, and they're separate shots. So how can we have 1 bullet from the rear hit Kennedy in the back and come out the neck? And that's the controversy. And how can it be a small neck wound? Next slide.
Oops, sorry.
Okay.
I hit end.
Let's see.
Sorry.
You're...
Wait, okay, the tape's rolling again.
Tape's rolling? Yeah, I'll leave to them. Yeah. We're getting close.
Sorry, it's got to
That's all right.
Can you repeat that last answer?
Okay. So back one more again. Keep going. Yeah. Oh, no, keep going, yeah. There we go. Okay. So not much of Kennedy sticks up above the back of the trunk. But what I'm going to propose is that the first shot was about 6 inches or 8 inches low. And it hits the back of the trunk and bounces up into Kennedy's shoulder and up through his neck. And you won't hear that anywhere else, so there's going to be controversy. Next slide. The pistons reciprocate while the wheels gyrate. The Lincoln machine knows not where it leans. Will our mechanical devices spare us from our sins and vices, or be the parting knell on our road to hell? Next slide. This is Clint Hill, and earlier in the motorcade, he apparently did jump on the back of the Kennedy limo. He's protecting Jackie, his assignment, but he later apparently must go and get back on the running board because by the time they get to Dealey Plaza, he's back on the running board. Next slide. And here he is on the running board. And again, you see here, not a lot of Jack's upper body is there. Just his shoulder blades and neck are visible from the back. Next slide. Clint Hill gets off the car and runs to help the president, jumps off the trailing car. And I wrote, run, Clint Hill, run, save our president from the gun. Run with all your might, it dreams that haunt the night. He was running between the 2 salvos, the 5 seconds. He had jumped off the running board after the first salvo and was almost to the car by this time the second shots came. Next slide. Abraham Zapruder. Next slide. This is Z-175 on the Zapruder, and Kennedy is right here. Can't see it very well. And then the background is the county records building. And so next slide. We're talking about slide 175. Next slide. And this is the simulation, computer simulation of that frame with Kennedy's head right about there with that groove in the county records building and the Secret Serviceman. Next slide. This is a view from the depository. The shrubs on this simulation are not quite right. They're a little bit more than this, but you can see that the shot 166 to 210 is blocked by this tree. So this is not a good shot at Kennedy at this position. Next slide. And here is a shot. Here's a view from the front of Kennedy, and you can see the Dow Tex building is a clear shot. And when you look at it from the Dow Tex, the heads of these Secret Servicemen are not a problem. And I think we've got it in the next slide. Yeah, they're a little more of a problem than this, but you can see that during the first salvo, the heads of the Secret Servicemen are not a problem. As they go farther down Elm Stream, the heads of the Secret Servicemen become more of a problem. But during this first salvo, it's a clear shot at Kennedy. Next slide. Here's the entry wound. And then I'm going to describe an exit wound in the neck, which is small, and that's a point of controversy. Next slide. I'll go into more detail. This is how I explain it. I've only got one bullet to explain this, so I'm explaining the entry wound in the back and the exit wound in the neck. Next slide. This is on a skeleton. It's a slight upward angle, as you can see. Next slide. And here's a side view. Next slide. Here's a frontal view, and the bullet is going slightly towards the middle. Ends up in the midline where the trachea is, and it enters a little bit to the right. So it's going a little bit right to left. Next slide. Now, in order to explain this, initially what they had is they had Kennedy kind of going like this to explain how you could have such a weird trajectory from the rear. But when the Zapruder film came out, you could see that Kennedy was sitting straight up. Next slide. Postal Inspector Harry Holmes testified he saw the passengers flinch as the debris flew up into the limousine. Holmes was watching from the post office building through binoculars, but a closer witness saw the same thing. This is Jack Franzen said she advised shortly after the President's automobile passed on Elm Street. Near where she and her family were standing, she heard a noise which sounded to her as if someone had thrown a firecracker into the President's automobile. She advised at approximately the same time she noticed dust or small pieces of debris flying from the President's automobile. So this is my basis for saying that the bullet could have hit the trunk just about 6 inches before the President and then went slightly up. Next slide. And this is a simulated view, and the bullet would go over the windshield. Next slide. Here's a side view of a bullet that was low, and again, it doesn't have to be low by much, and then enter Kennedy at the upper back and exit the neck. Next slide. Here's yet another view from the other side. Next slide. And yet another view. Next slide. So we'll skip the geometry, but basically the bullet can come in from the 3rd or 4th floor of the Dow Tex and at about a 14-degree angle, traveling upward or 12-degree angle. And this is all approximate. Next floor. Next slide. So if it hit Kennedy about 6 inches above the top of from the limo trunk, 12-degree angle, there should be maybe. You'd think did anybody notice a strike on the trunk? Next slide. And this is what the limo looked like. There's a little spot there. Next slide, which I blew up. You know, I don't know if that's a strike of the bullet. It's just it may be an antenna. I don't know. Nobody knows what that is. We do know the car was repainted, so there's no way we're going to know if there was a strike on the back of the trunk. Next slide. The second shot, Deputy Walters in the lead car turns around after he hears the first sound and sees a bullet hit the street. Roy Skelton of the Triple Underpass said, "I heard another shot and saw the bullet hit the pavement." So the second shot, the concrete was knocked in the south away from the car. Next slide. So now we're talking about 204. Next slide. Here's a view at 204 on the Zapruder film, and this is Kennedy right here going behind the sign, and he is already starting to grab his neck and has been shot. Next slide. And here's the simulation at 204. You've got the witnesses standing here and the people taking the pictures here that are standing right here. Next slide. And here's 204. In reality, this tree is still in the way. We said it was in the way from 166 to 210, and so there's still not a good shot from the depository. Next slide. And again, you do have a good shot here from the Dell techs. The heads of Secret Servicemen are still not a problem. Next slide. Here's the view. If you miss Kennedy at this point, and the bullet, and remember the car is also slightly downhill, so the windshield is slightly lower as it's going down Elm Street. And a bullet that's 6 inches above his head or 12 inches above his head will miss the windshield, miss the front of the car, and will go and hit the curb in front of James Tague, which is right here. James Tague is standing here. So this shot would be in line if it was 12 inches high, or maybe not even that much, with the car leaning, dropping down Elm Street and the windshield lower, that it would be in line to hit the street and then be in line to hit the curb in front of James Tague. So this shot could happen at this point and strike the curb. Next slide. And here's James Tague, and here's the curb about here. I think they said 12 feet or something in front of him. Next slide. This talks about James Tague, and we all know about him. There's a spot on his cheek, and next slide. There's the spot on the curb. Next slide. And this is a shot from the Dell techs at 204 coming down, and here's the curb in front of Tague. That's just a two-dimensional drawing. If you try to do this from the book depository, the shot would have to be fired to be in line to hit that curb. Would have to be around frame 440 when the assassination was over, and that's why Bob Groden and others have said that they feel the shot had to come from the Dow techs, or Bob Groden even suggested the county records. Next slide. And here's 204, and the bullet is in line to hit Tague. Next slide. Here's a view from the depository, and here's Kennedy, I'm sorry, from the Dow techs. It's in line to hit James Tague, who's standing right about here. Next slide. And if you try to line it up from the depository and hit James Tague, aiming at Kennedy, the assassination is already over. He's already passed this crosswalk. Next slide. Let's skip this in the interest of time. And here's a position. This is how James Tague would see it. The L-Tex missed to Kennedy, in line to hit the curb in front of him. Next slide. Witness F. Lee Mudd thought one or two of the shots came from the Dow Tex building. Staying on the north curve of Elm Street, he dropped to the ground when the shots were fired, looked toward the corner of Elm and Houston, looked around him. He recalled that in looking toward the building, he noted several broken windows on the fourth floor of the Dow Tex, and the thought occurred to him that possibly the shots had been fired through these windows. Any sniper would not stick his gun out the window. They would set up with a hole in the window about 6 feet behind the window that would muffle the sound, and also you wouldn't see them. Next slide. So, analyzing the Tague shot, let's skip this in the interest of time. We'll go on to the next slide. Next one too, please. 24 is the Connolly shot, and this we saw earlier today. Next slide. Connolly is hit at about 226 or so. Next slide. And now we're talking about the Connolly shot. Next slide. And this is viewed from the Zapruder pedestal. Next slide. Okay. Next slide. And that's the magic bullet. Keep going. The magic bullet doesn't go straight. It breaks into pieces but doesn't lose weight. It zigzags back and forth, don't you see? That's how one bullet does the work of three. Next slide. And this is how what happens now is that John Kennedy has moved towards Jackie, and the bullet, and John Connolly has turned around. The bullet either comes over his left shoulder, hits Connolly in the armpit, and comes out his nipple, and it doesn't hit his wrist. Remember, it's got to hit the back of his wrist, so his wrist is not hit, but his leg is hit. And it's debatable on whether it comes over his left shoulder or right shoulder, but it does not hit Kennedy. Next slide. Next slide. And here's, again, a view from the rear, and you still have a shot from the Dow text. That's clear. Next slide. Here's a side view of a shot to Connolly. Next slide. The bullet then shattered Connolly's right wrist. At least that's the official media blitz. It fractured his wrist, and that was that. But he still held on to a Stetson hat. Next slide. This is 224 viewed from the Dell Tex, and you still have a clear shot. Again, Kennedy has moved slightly to his left as he's grabbed his throat, and I think the bullet comes over his right shoulder and hits Connolly in the right armpit. Next slide. And this is Alton's Z255. There's no fractured windshield yet. Next slide. And this is a close-up, and there's Kennedy, who can be seen grabbing his throat. Next slide. We can't see in this picture up higher. It'd be nice to see 1 or 2 floors up higher. Next slide. Jackie later tells a friend, get a good driver. Driver gear does not accelerate. Jack explains, according to Enrique's Secret Service man who recently died, Jack said, get me to a hospital, I've been hit. Next slide. As driver Greer looks back, Clint Hill jumps off the trailing car during that interim between the 2 volleys and starts running towards Jackie's car. And that may explain why driver Greer did not accelerate. Maybe he looked back, saw Clint Hill running, and slowed down to give him a chance to get on the, which is violating Secret Service protocol. Next slide. Next slide. This is just before the headshot. Notice that Jackie is almost in front of John, as Joaquin Marcus points out when he did his 3-dimensional analysis. A shot from the rear would certainly leave some blood on Jackie's dress, which did not happen, and would also possibly even hit Jackie. Next slide. 312 next. Here it is viewed from the Zapruder pedestal, directly across from Zapruder when the headshot occurs. Next slide. Here's a view of the Mary Mormon's position. This motorcycle policeman, Officer Harkis, gets splattered with fragments of bone that go into his vest and stick in his vest. And here's the grassy knoll. Next slide. Let's see, Mary Mormon and Jean Hill. Next slide. And here is Jean Hill and Mary Mormon. She's trying to take a picture here, but her camera won't shoot because it's a Polaroid, and she's just fired a shot looking back towards the depository, and the camera automatically takes like 5 seconds to recharge the battery. So she's holding her camera there, but still hadn't taken a picture. Next slide. And still, she hadn't taken a picture yet because Kennedy hasn't passed her yet. Next slide. Jean Hill had an investigator that told her that she was wrong, that she must have heard just 3 shots, not 4 or 5. Next slide. And here, Mary Mormon is getting ready to take her picture finally. Next slide. And here's where she takes her picture. The car has just passed, and next slide. And next slide. Next slide. Polaroid number 4, which was taken towards a depository, may have showed the 5th floor or 4th floor window, was confiscated and it's never been published or seen since. Next slide. This was the Mormon photo number 5 that was seen, and this is just before the headshot. The grassy knoll is here, and this is the man, his motorcycle gets splattered with the blood and brain and bone. Next slide. And here's a simulated view of the motorcycle, and next slide. Here's an overhead view of the same thing, grassy knoll. Next slide. Here's a helicopter view, and you can see how Officer Harkis would get splattered from a shot from there. Next slide. And that's Z12 from the grassy knoll. And you notice he doesn't shoot directly across because that's a harder shot. He shoots at almost like a 30 or 45 degree angle. Next slide. And here's an overhead view from the 312. Next slide. And here's a view from the depository. Very difficult shot from here. Next slide. This is from the depository, and these heads actually come in even closer. And as Joaquin Marcus said, there's a sea of heads at 312 from the depository. Next slide. And that's Joaquin Marcus's study. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. These are Mormon photographs. Next slide. Next slide. Here's a simulated view of what happened. The debris, blood and bone, splatters. Next slide. And this is from the 312, and you see that you have a sea of heads. Next slide. Here's a shot from the rear. It's these Secret Servicemen are still not a problem. These two have sat down, and you have a shot at Kennedy. Next slide. And here's a few from the front. Next slide. 320 is near where Connolly's about to get hit. Next slide. And hit his right wrist. Here's 326. He's holding his Stetson hat. You can't see it very well. Next slide. And here's a shot from the rear. Next slide. And you still have a clear shot. Next slide. And Connolly is still holding onto a Stetson hat. Next slide. And now his wrist is to the back of the depository like this. And now it's in a position where the bullet can enter the back of his wrist and fracture his wrist and drop the hat. Next slide. And here is the bullet strikes the back of Connolly's right wrist. Next slide. And then splinters from the Connolly shot when his hand is up like this and he's holding the hat. That's the opportunity for the windshield to get struck with fragments of lead and crack the windshield. Next slide. And here's the overhead position. Next slide. Here's the trunk at Parkland. If there was a bullet strike there, you wouldn't know it right away because they've lifted up the trunk. Next slide. My solution has a tight shot pattern. None of the shots are more than 12 inches off the target. Next slide. Next slide. We've covered these. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So there is an explanation that we can combine the Zuberter film with the acoustics in 3 dimensions, but you've got to put 2 of the shooters in the Daltex and 1 of the grassy knoll. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. These are things we've gone over. Next slide. Next slide. That's the thought I'm going to leave you with. That's how I can explain a bullet entering the back and exiting the neck. Next slide. We all agree that your theory is crazy. The question that divides us is whether it's crazy enough to have a chance of being correct. One of the controversies, that's all of the slides, is, everybody says, including Charles Crenshaw, who I talked to and respected, that this neck wound must be an exit wound because it's so small. But the skin of the neck is very elastic, and when I did thyroid surgery, you could put a 4-millimeter drain in through the skin, and then the next day you go to take it out, and you don't even have to put a stitch back in because the skin falls back together. So you could have a 6.5-millimeter hole in the neck, which is pliable skin that can look like an entry wound. I've got a patient of mine who was marching in Vietnam or running in Vietnam as a sniper, and this buddy next to him fell down dead, was hit with friendly fire from M16, and I've got him on tape where he says that they could not tell the entry wound from the exit wound on a full metal jacket. If you don't hit bone, the bullet doesn't fractionate and keeps its velocity and its momentum. The Mannlicher-Carcano bullet was actually designed to go through 2 or 3 people and wound a bunch of people, so that a bunch of medics would have to come and get tied up, carrying them away. It was not a frangible bullet. The entry wound in the back, I think a lot of people do accept that as an entry wound, but the controversy is how could this be an exit wound in the neck when it's so small? And that's one of the controversies that this creates.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Got a little. We're going to let one question, but we got a little bit of time to take a break, and there's until 10 hot cookies and milk downstairs, and come back. We've got Russ Baker coming on right at 10. Randy Benson will probably do some presentation about his film, The Searchers, after that for movie night. So
there's one last thought I'll leave you with. The students I talk to say, well, how do you explain the pigeons taking off? How do you explain the pigeons taken off from the roof of the depository if the shots came from the Daltex? And the pigeons would accumulate at lunchtime because the workers would go up on the roof and feed them. So they were there every day at noon. So is it stretching it too much to say that a well thought out misdirection would fire a shot from somebody on the roof to scatter the pigeons, and that would explain that other sound on the acoustic tape that isn't a rifle sound but is either a firecracker or pistol? But to what extent did this deception occur? And the story about Marion Baker going into the depository, he said, well, I went in there because I saw the pigeons fly off the roof. And then he didn't go in there, and the people in front of the depository, they ran to the grassy knoll. So, it's those are other issues that people bring up. Yeah.
Have you tracked who brought you the acoustic tape?
I just used D.B. Thomas's shot sequence. I did not study the acoustic tape. It's too complicated for me. I just took his numbers that he gave us
Does
earlier.
anybody in this room know who brought the acoustic tape? Belt, who provided it for the House Select Committee?
Mary
Repeat that.
Mack.
Mary Farrell. Brought it forward.
One of the controversies is people say, well, the acoustic tape can't be correct. But that's one of the premises of this explanation. It's kind of like a Rubik's Cube. You accept this premise, you come up with this solution, you know. And you don't accept that premise until you've got all sorts of other solutions. Yeah.
Yeah, being in a doctor position, if a bullet hits a person here and it goes straight to the back, will that make him paralyzed where he cannot raise his shoulders?
Again, if it misses the spinal cord, no.
What if it hits the spinal cord right at that place?
Oh, well, sure, yeah, but it didn't do that. It nicked the transverse process of T2. It was about 2 inches or 3 inches lateral to the spinal cord.
The Daltex building is a large building in its own right. What position in the Daltex building are you talking about? Are you suggesting that this came from? What height and what position?
It would need to be shallow in order to miss Kennedy's head high and not break the windshield. Remember at Z255, the Alkins photo, the windshield's not cracked. So the bullet went over the windshield at that time and hit the street and went on to hit Chegg. So a shallow position such as the third or fourth floor.
Some of the photographs you had showed the third floor.
I could not find photographs of the third floor. I could see the second floor. And then F. Lee Mudd was the one who said the fourth floor had 2 broken windows in it. I can't find any pictures of that. And the picture that Mary Mormon took was pulled and disappeared.
I've heard some discussion about the Daltex building and the fire escape that is on the side, which is in the middle of the building. But if you stand in the middle of the building, not the edge, but the middle, you have a good view down Houston Street, but not a good view down Elm Street because the school book depository is blocking that view at that point.
On this JFK Reloaded, you can click on that middle row, and you still got a good view down the street. If you stand in the middle of the lane of Elm Street without getting run over by all the cars, and you can look and see that middle row. Now, he could have been on the far south row also. You know, I don't know exactly where they were.
Because we know one man who was on the fire escape, and so I went down there and in the position along the sidewalk where the fire escape was. It has since been removed. And what I could see from there was, in fact, a good view down Houston Street, but there's a point at which the edge of the school book depository blocks your view of Elm Street. I mean, anybody can leave here today and walk by there and see that, I think.
Yeah.
I would like to suggest possibly a 2-bullet approach to the neck and the backbone. In 1974, I watched the...
We're going to go a long time on this, but...
No, I'll be real quick about it.
But I mean, there's so much controversy here, but go ahead.
I watched the Geraldo Rivera show where they showed the Zapruder film and did an analysis. And they showed it twice that evening. When I first saw the film, the first anomalous thing that appeared in the film to me was this gray mist that went out behind Kennedy's head. And that's when he went for the neck. Now, that mist was blown away in the wind, and it was at a slight angle upwards. And I bolted out of my chair and said to my friend, "Did you see that? The first shot came from in front of him. Below him, it had to come from the storm sewer opening."
Right.
Now, that would have muffled that sound, and it would be a perfect place to shoot with a pistol.
But it violates the acoustics, would be the only thing.
Not if it's muffled back up under the ground like that. Now, they since have removed that second drain opening and put a street lamp there. And a friend of mine, I used to play soccer for years, was a sergeant on the police department, and I asked him about that one time, and he said, well, they told us that they removed that to quell speculation a shot could have come from there. Now, the second night the film had the mist edited out.
Okay. This is the simplest solution. 2 shooters in the Deltex and 1 at the grassy knoll. Other solutions, I think, is it Dim, who is it that has 5 shooter, or we heard 11 shots earlier this morning. I mean, it depends what premises you start with as to what conclusions you're going to come up with. And that's a perfectly legitimate alternate explanation. Yeah.
One person, and I discussed the headwind, was said, one person, Stuart Gallo, and I discussed a head wound with him. If I understood him correctly, he said that the debris didn't go flying backwards, but it created kind of a halo. And Hargis was hit very hard because his motorcycle rode into it. So he's going forward, and he rides into the debris. And maybe I misunderstood Stuart, but is that a tenable premise? You ride into something on a motorcycle going 11 miles an hour, maybe a bit of skull, and it whacks you, and it will get lodged in your vest because of the speed of the motorcycle.
Well, as Jim Mars has said also, I mean, that is a possibility. I don't know how fast you have to go to get bone embedded in your vest, probably faster than 11 miles an hour.
But the
But
bone
also
wasn't
there's
embedded.
a big piece of skull that blew back and left,
That's right. And also, Tom, Hargis said on the 30th anniversary in the Dallas Morning News that the brain matter arced up into the air and then came down on him.
So, in other words, the brain matter, it was not a halo thing. Well, if it arced up in the air, then how could it hit him?
Blood and bone fragment and part of the brain came back on him, and hard enough that through his jacket he thought he'd been hit. He stopped.
It's and that wouldn't be just from driving the motorcycle into the debris. Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think there's a photo of a bullet strike on the rear roll of the passenger. How would that fit?
Sir?
Sir, ask me. I believe there's a photo showing a bullet strike on the chrome at the top of the windshield on the back side. How would this fit into your sequence of shots if a bullet was striking the back of the windshield?
Are you referring to that chrome upper lid? One explanation would be Connolly's wrist was up. The final shot went through and through the wrist from the back to the front. He's lying down, but his hat is up like this, and the windshield is cracked, and conceivably one of the fragments would have dented that piece of chrome. Now, officially, the Secret Service says that chrome was like that because when the convertible lever was pulled, that it left that indentation there. But my explanation would be that it would have to be the final Connolly bullet. That's the only one that could have done that.
Thank you.
If you're accepting these premises.
Robert Cutler, whose charts you used as part of this early researcher, did I thought a very brilliant analysis by saying, all right, let's accept the Warren Commission version of the through and through shot, and then you'd have to have it at a certain angle of entry and exit, not to go through the spinal cord, the tracheal bone. So he figured that out. He laid out the plats like that. He got it down to nautical angles of the bodies and placed each thing and he's an architect. And so he says, take the bullet backwards that they're saying, at the angle that they're saying. And when he does it, it doesn't get high enough to get to the 6th floor window of the book depository. It doesn't get over far enough to get to the book depository, but it does go back toward the Daltex.
I like that.
So even their official version doesn't lead to their official sniper's nest. But we should take a little break, and then we'll try to come back at 10. Thanks.
There's copies of my poem book back there. It's a 300-page poem. If you saw a couple of verses earlier from the
A lot of poets here in this crowd.